Hello and welcome to another Goodwill Services of West Michigan. Hello and welcome to part one of our VITA Income Tax Assistance Services for West Michigan training on volunteering, filing basics, and screening and interviewing. My name is Amanda Grover. I am the Career Supports Manager here at Goodwill, and I'm going to be going through some of the filing basics and how to get started on filing a tax return for our taxpayers if you're a new volunteer to our site, or even if you just need a refresher on how this whole process works, all of your tools and all of the various items that you'll see at the tax sites when you come to volunteer. So to jump right in, what you're going to expect from some of these trainings, I did touch on this for the introduction video, but this is part one. This is under just some of the basics of volunteering when you arrive to the tax site, the filing basics that you need to know, what the clients will come in with, and how you get them started, and then we'll go through some of the screening and interview information as well. We'll take that information and jump into starting the tax returns, review exemptions, and some of the filing status basics. We're following the 1040 form as well. So if you're used to filling out returns with the old paper and pen or pencil method, this is following the tax return itself, and this is what most tax software systems do as well. So you should be pretty familiar with this format if you've had any experience with taxes before. If you're brand new, you'll see how everything starts to make sense and how it lines up as well. So it does make sense in the order that it follows. So after income, we'll go into some adjustments or things that reduce the taxable income. We'll look at standard deductions versus itemizing, as well as exemptions. So I know you guys are very excited about that. The last part is really the fun stuff. So we start talking about tax credits, some of the other taxes, and what it looks like when you're finished with a return. So the tax credits are really the big piece of that, and we'll go through each of the tax credits that our VITA program works with. This training is pertinent to various volunteer positions. So we'll talk a lot about VITA volunteers and needing tax preparers and what they call site coordinators. The site coordinator is a person that is there to make sure that all the taxes are done properly. This is usually a person where they've had several years experience with VITA, but it doesn't have to be. It's more of a leadership position, but we definitely need those people there at our tax sites. You don't have to be a prior year volunteer. You just have to be willing to take on just a little bit extra as far as responsibilities go when you're a VITA volunteer. So also tax preparers, that's what a lot of the information in these trainings are speaking to, are to the tax preparers and volunteers. But some of the other positions that if you're a little bit apprehensive about doing taxes that might be appropriate for you is we always need people to assist with greeting. That is huge, and you'll see in the upcoming slides and the beginning portion of this training how much a greeter can do if there is a greeter available at a site. We are working to make sure that at our busier sites that there are greeters. Some of the tax sites operate and they don't have a lot of space, and there really isn't space to have a greeter available, but we do try to have greeters available where it is available and appropriate. We also sometimes need language interpreters, so sometimes we'll get a Spanish-speaking family. It's great for us to have an ideal amount of interpreters, whether it's for another language. Sometimes it might be a signing volunteer, but somebody that can come in and assist us with those language barriers. Quality reviewers, it would be great if we had one person that would certify to do quality reviewing at some of our busier sites, but quality reviewers and that as a standalone position is a thing that's very rare at most of the tax sites. So you may see that listed as a separate position, but a lot of the time the site coordinators are doing the quality review process. And what the quality reviewers are doing is they're just going through the tax return another time to make sure that everything is done properly. We actually do quality reviewing training in these modules as well as at our tax sites so that everybody kind of understands what a quality review is. You as a tax preparer, if that's what you're volunteering to do, tax preparers should always be very understanding of the quality review process because we ideally like to have the tax preparers go through and quality review their own work before asking another person to do it. We also always need some data input assistance, so this is typically just taking some of the information from the tax returns and putting it into some data. So working a lot with spreadsheets and that sort of thing. So if you're somebody that likes to help more with the clerical end of things, we definitely need assistance with those pieces with this tax program as well. So there's a position for just about every type of personality and every type of person that is interested in volunteering and working with the VITA program. So to jump into some of the things that the different positions will need or be required of learning, this is a full, very comprehensive list of what is covered in these modules as well as what's covered on the Link Learn certification page through the IRS. We go through all of these topics and this information in these modules, but we do like to give you kind of a scope as to what you're going to see in the training. So that's basically for tax preparer. That's going to vary a little bit if somebody certifies to a basic level, but like I indicated in our introductory training, we are encouraging all of our volunteers who are tax preparers to certify to that advanced level. And this is a comprehensive list of what those topics include under that certification level. This is listed. I just wanted to make sure everybody understands the various certification needs that the IRS requires if you're going to be a volunteer with the program as well as be working with the clients at the VITA sites. So we want to make sure you go through your VITA standards of conduct training, and there's an exam with that piece, as well as the screening and interviewing training. Now there is not any sort of testing with that piece, but that's something that you're definitely going to want to go through. I touch on a lot of it here in this training, but it's never bad to go through some of this information again, just to make sure that you get it in your head correctly. The screening and interview training takes about 40 minutes of that, and it's really good information with getting started and working with people at the tax sites, especially if this is your first year. So make sure you go through that screening and interview training. It is on that Link Learn certification page, so if you just go right to the IRS website, that linklearncertification.com, you'll see this training on there for the interviewing and training, or for the interviewing and screening. There's also the actual certification itself. So this again is just going to cover the federal tax law that we go through in these first 5 training session modules. And you can certify to either basic or advanced. And again, we're encouraging everybody to go ahead and certify to that advanced level, and knowing that you do not have to take the basic level certification in order to just start on your advanced level. So keep that in mind. If you have any questions regarding the certification levels, anything on linklearncertification.com, make sure to contact Carl Lewis, the tax program coordinator. He can walk you through all that. He does a great job with that. So there's a few things that people are concerned about when they are learning about signing up to be a volunteer. And that's basically knowing what's within the scope and what sort of tax returns you'll be working on and which ones you can't. So just to start by saying, a lot of the returns that we do and that we see are extremely simple. And that's why we want to make sure that we're utilizing this as an opportunity to educate people a little bit, nothing over their head, but so that taxes aren't such an intimidating piece to them. But also just understanding that you get the training you need on the returns that we're doing. So some of the more complex returns, or some of the things that we do not do at our VITA sites, are returns where somebody cannot substantiate their identity. So basically when, and we'll get into more of this information a little bit later in this training, but at the tax sites we require that everybody come in with identification. That includes a state ID with their picture, or something with their picture, as well as something from Social Security. So we don't do returns if somebody cannot identify themselves or if they don't have that information. And that's really for the client or the taxpayer safety, and that's because there's been so many issues of identity theft. We also don't do tax returns where anything is missing. So that includes W-2s or 1099s. If there's something missing from the tax return and a client identifies that, we don't want to get started on the tax return because we don't know if they'll come in to finish it up. So we don't want to waste the volunteer's time or anyone else's time when they come in. We need to be able to start the return and finish it when they come in. If they're missing one piece of information and it's at their house, you may be able to work something out and be a little bit flexible. But as you're learning those rules, talk with your site coordinator to see what's possible and what's fair to the other clients that are coming in and to the other volunteers as well. Okay, so jumping into some of the different tax forms and some of the things that we see at the tax site, we do not work with anyone that has any sort of rental income unless they are in the military and that you're a person that is military certified. But just generally, if somebody comes into your tax site and they indicate that they rent out an upper unit in their home, we cannot do that tax return. We also can't do any tax returns that are reporting certain royalty income, some self-employment. So if there's a business and they're earning over $25,000 a year, we cannot touch that return. So even if it's a small business, we just don't do them. That's out of scope for what we're able to do. There's a full list in that 4012, your resource guide, your publication 4012 book. It's a really great, useful tool. And if you're not sure about a tax return, just consult your site coordinator. I know especially as you get started with these tax returns and especially if it's your first year or you're just getting back into the swing of things, it's fine to consult someone and just make sure that you're being respectful of somebody's security, of their confidentiality. Don't scream it across the room, but maybe just confer with another volunteer and site coordinator to make sure that something is within scope of the program. So I've talked a lot about the certification and why we have the requirements of volunteers that we do with the VITA program and some of the certification that's involved with that. So I do want to talk just briefly about the certification. I know I touched on it in the introductory training, but it's always good to review some information. You do receive the test itself, so a publication 6744. That is going to be electronic this year, but feel free to print it out, or if you really would like a printed version, let Carl know, and we'll work on that for you. But you do have the opportunity to take the test twice, and you only have to receive an 80% on it. When you go online to the linklearncertificationpage.com, on the left-hand side, there will be login information. To access your certification test, you have to sign up and register under that login information on the left side of the screen under linklearncertification.com. Again, it's open note, open books. It's not timed. You can start the test itself and come back to it at any other time. I do encourage you, though, to take a paper copy and do the test first before you open it up online. I've just found that it makes it a little less anxiety ridden. I'm able to answer the questions properly and completely, whereas before sometimes I would just go into the actual software, open the test, and start doing the test, and I found that I got a lot more questions wrong because I wasn't just putting information in. I had to think about it, make sure I was reading the question correctly. You can eliminate all that by just doing the test in your book. You can do the test and retest, and then that way you'll have the questions and the answers for all of the different questions that come up, whether it's from the test or the retest itself. So keep that in mind. And really, I know the certification sounds like it's a lot of hoops to jump through, but what it's doing is it's really preparing you in advance for what you're going to see at the tax site. So I can't stress it enough how important it is for you to go through the test to make sure for the certification exam that you really understand it and that you have a good grasp of it, that you understand the software. The certification is really in place to make you prepared as a volunteer. So also with the certification test is it provides you volunteer protection. So if you're certified, that makes sure that, and you've done a return that's within your scope, it really makes sure that you are being covered under the Volunteer Act, that you're not doing anything that's out of scope. And then that way, if there are, for some reason, some mistakes on the tax return, you're not personally liable for it. You should never be asked to solicit donations or be making any sort of business. And just another thing that the volunteer protection covers you under is again, the mistakes that could be made. As long as it's not done on purpose or information is omitted or put into the return that's false and you know that, then you're completely covered under any sort of mistakes or issues that are between the taxpayer and the program itself. So it has nothing to do with you individually once you're covered under this certification. We're going to jump into some of the just basics and the building blocks of ethical behavior and some of the things that you're going to see in the volunteer standards of conduct training. So the program itself is very diligent about making sure that we address unethical behavior. I will say that VITA Services for West Michigan itself, I've never had any sort of experiences with any issues of unethical behavior on behalf of the volunteers. The volunteers for this program are generally just really great people, giving up some of their time to help others, and there typically are not any sort of issues, but I do want to just go through the rules just to make sure that we understand them. Obviously, they are in place because there have been issues in the past at some sites, but we know that won't become an issue at our VITA sites here in West Michigan. So just going through, we want to make sure that you understand unethical behavior, and that's basically any action that's used without a lack of knowledge, or it can be a simple mistake. So that's not unethical behavior. Mistakes happen a lot, and a lot of the time we are catching them at the tax sites. We're catching them either by the software or in that intake and interview process, and sometimes in the quality review process. But unethical behavior is when there is a lack of following the rules, or somebody does something that's wrong, and especially knowingly when it's wrong, that's when we have some issues. So we'll go through some of the basic standards of conduct, as they're called, and this is really the building blocks for that standard of conduct training. So there's 10 quality site requirements. Those are listed at the tax sites. We will go through them on the next slide, but just so that you're aware of them, they are listed at the tax sites on the paper, but they're also listed in your 4012 publication that the IRS provides you. So they're very basic site requirements. It's basically just ensuring that there's quality and consistency across the board from VITA site to VITA site nationally, even though ours is just serving our local community. Another one of the standards of conduct is that we can't accept any payment or solicit donations. So the big piece about this program is that it's free, and we want to keep it free. That it's a service in place by volunteers to help the community. So we want to make sure that the service is remaining free, that we don't look like we're soliciting donations. If somebody is very persistent about wanting to assist the program, Goodwill is the fiduciary for the program. They're able to write a check to the program itself through Goodwill, but we don't have any sort of donation signs. We're not trying to solicit any sort of money for the program, but we do want to make sure that people understand that piece and that it is a free service. We're using it to provide education and a quality service. We cannot solicit business from taxpayers to assist and use any knowledge gained from their information for any other sort of benefit. So what that basically means is that we can't take any of the information off the tax return and use it for anything else. We also can't solicit business for any other organization. So you can't go to the tax site, especially if you're a CPA and you're looking to get continuing education credits. Even if it's a return that's not in our VITA scope, you can't say, hey, but if you come to my business, I can do your tax return for $100. So we can't have any sort of business solicitations. I'm also even very careful about that when it comes to having bank information out. We can't solicit information or business for banks or any other groups. So we want to make sure that the program is confidential and that we're not taking advantage of our clients and their information. I know it sounds obvious, but we cannot knowingly prepare a false return. So if your friend comes up and you're doing their tax return, which is fine, you can do your friend's tax returns and you can even prepare them before the tax season starts if you wanted to have them come in and do a practice on them and do their return just in practice and ask them questions and that sort of thing. We obviously encourage that. But what we don't encourage is putting information on there that is not correct. So say your friend comes in and they want to claim their maybe their sister that's been living with them for 3 months. If they don't pass the information to properly claim somebody, we can't do it just because we know it'll make them have a higher refund. So it's good to try to help people, but we still have to be honest on the tax returns. We don't want to miss any credit or any exemption that the taxpayer is eligible for, but we also can't knowingly prepare something that's incorrect. I know it sounds very obvious, but we cannot engage in criminal, infamous, dishonest, or notoriously disgraceful conduct that has a negative impact on the program. So again, keep in mind that the program serves a lot of people in the area. It serves a lot of different agencies and community partners, clients, as well as just general people in the community. It's a great activity for volunteers. So if we if there were any issues with this, with any criminal or infamous or dishonest activity, then we could possibly lose the very small grant that we get to support the program, and we wouldn't be able to operate the program in general. So that's why we're so strict about the rules and making sure that all the information is displayed at the tax sites. We want to make sure that everybody really understands and that we're transparent with what we're doing, how it's funded, and how everything works in collaboration. Lastly, just make sure that you're treating all taxpayers as well as the other tax preparers with a professional and courteous and respectful manner. So we've never had any sort of huge issues between volunteers at our tax sites. Everyone seems to get along for the most part for the great, and it's a great way to meet people, but make sure that we're also paying our taxpayers the respect that they deserve, that they've come in for a service and they're there to get a service as well as to get some information. So make sure that you're respectful with them. Every now and then we have disorderly clients that come in. It hasn't happened for a couple years, but if you are having issues with a taxpayer that does come in, just let your site coordinator know. They can work to have them either removed to the site or hopefully sometimes just de-escalate the situation. Sometimes having another person in place to explain something can be really helpful to some of the taxpayers, especially if they're upset. A lot of the time that's just happening because they don't understand the circumstances and they just need something re-explained to them. So we're going to go through some of the quality site requirements that I previously mentioned. So a lot of them are very basic, or a lot of them are already printed through the software. But one of the requirements of each tax site that you go to is that all volunteers on site must be certified. So their certification must be at the tax site. This is already done by Carl. Carl will go through and collect all of your certification forms and make sure that they're at all of the tax sites. So it's not like you have to bring in your certification to every tax site you volunteer at, but it does ensure that there is the certification that's on site. And so Carl will take care of that. One of the things that you have to make sure that you do is make sure that every single person coming in for a federal tax return has their intake and interview form completed, and that there has been an intake and interview process. So when somebody comes into the tax site, even if it's just a tax site with 2 preparers, we have to make sure that the taxpayer is utilizing that intake and interview form, even if it seems like a very simple return they're working with. Number 3 for our quality site requirement is that we require that there's a quality review on every single return that's completed at our tax site. So we make sure to go through that quality review checklist that's on the back of the intake and interview form. It becomes like second nature, especially if you're at a smaller tax site where you're checking each other's work. Is first a lot of people start by utilizing the quality review form, and then they'll eventually just memorize it and kind of go through the list and check it off. as they're doing the quality review. So it becomes like second nature and you get used to the items that are on the quality review form, but don't let it become such an ingrained piece of the process that you forget to do it, because it still is very vital. Volunteer agreements, so those are the forms that your certification is turned in on. We just need to make sure that you've signed them. So when Carl goes through before tax season starts, and as he's getting all of the volunteer information coordinated and gets all of the information over to the tax sites, is he makes sure that you've signed that agreement. Timely e-filing must take place, and so this is why in the previous training and throughout the training we indicate that we don't want people starting a tax return that they can't finish in the same day and in the same time slot that somebody comes in, and that's in large part because of this number 6 rule for the quality site requirement. It's that all returns must be filed timely, so that's within 22 hours. Also, when they're filing the tax returns, we also need to see them sign this e-file authorization. It's called an 8879, but at any rate, it's a form that prints out with a tax return. We do not keep that form on site, but we do need to see the client sign it. And what the client is doing when they sign that form is indicating that they're taking responsibility for everything on the tax return, and that the person is providing confirmation that the site can e-file it on their behalf. So that's something that automatically takes place typically, but just make sure you keep that in mind, that we really are supposed to be filing these tax returns on time, and that's at time. Number 7, your civil rights are protected sign. There's a few different signs that are required at the tax sites, and this is just one of them, and it's to ensure that there's no sort of discrimination on the tax sites. We've never had any issues with this. We've always done really well anytime the IRS has come in for an audit, but that is one of the things that the IRS looks for when they come on site to review and make sure that the site is operating with all the proper requirements, paperwork, and documentation at and on site. The site identification number, as well as number 9, the electronic filing identification number, these are 2 numbers that are automatically printed on the tax returns. They're put into the software when we sign up the tax site, the actual software to the tax site. So that's not anything that you as a preparer or a greeter would have to worry about. It's automatically put onto the tax forms. And they print and they're submitted directly to the IRS. Lastly, privacy and confidentiality. I know I talked about that quite a bit already, but I can't say it enough and how important it is. We want to make sure that we're being very respectful of people's information. Part of that is making sure to wear our volunteer name badges. They will be available for you your first day on site unless you ask for it previous to that. But we'll have them available on site. Again, this is one of those things that the IRS looks for when they do an audit, and some of these site audits are done very either last minute, or they'll just show up to the site and make sure that everything is operating properly. They may have a secret shopper come in and make sure that all these rules are being followed. So know that that does exist. That does happen. It's not to scare you, but it's to ensure that we have consistency at our various tax sites and that we have everything we need available at them as well. So volunteers must be wearing name badges, and then all taxpayers must be able to substantiate their identity as well as their social security numbers. So that social security number is going to come off of either a card or sometimes a social security benefit statement, but we have to have something that has those specific social security numbers for each specific person in the home. So there has to be the identification if it's the adult. But if it's a child or somebody that's being claimed as a dependent on the return, then you only need the Social Security number itself on the Social Security card, though, or Social Security benefit statement. And then I know this goes without saying, but do not ever share any taxpayer information with anyone. And when you're talking with the taxpayer on site, do your best to keep it as confidential as possible. I know sometimes some of the sites get a little bit tight, but we've set everything up specifically the way it is set up, and that's to ensure as the maximum amount of confidentiality that we can provide at the tax sites. So we'll review this one more time, but this is some really important information. Again, you should be able to pass most of the standards, conducts, and standard conduct of training through your certification system utilizing this information. So we're going to go through a little bit of information about the interview process and what that looks like when somebody comes in to the tax site to have their taxes prepared. I'm going to go through this as quickly as I can, but I do want to touch on the main points, some of the most important points. This is all in the intake and interview training that's on the Link Learn certification page, but I do want to point out some of the very, like I said, the very key points and things that are going to be most beneficial to you at the tax sites, especially if this is your first year. So before you do the intake, the interview process, and when you're after the person has completed their intake and interview form, just make sure that if you're a taxpayer or even if you're a greeter, that you introduce yourself. You should be wearing that name badge. It helps just to make small talk to clear the air, but make sure that they understand too all of the forms, what they're there for. It's really just the intake and interview form, and then going through and explaining the process, because when you help explain why something is required or why it is the way it is, one, it resonates with people and makes them kind of understand what they're doing, but two, it can make it happen a lot easier. People are typically a lot more compliant once they see that there's a purpose and a real reason as to what they're doing. So just explain the steps of them filling out the intake and interview form, why you want to see some of their information, like all of their tax forms and that site, their identification as well as social security card. So explain why you need those things and why you're verifying them. Verify and make sure that all the information on the intake and interview sheet is completed. If somebody doesn't complete something, it's typically, there's a column that indicates that they weren't sure about something, so go through that. But if they've left it blank, that typically means that they just didn't understand the question. So make sure you go through that. And if you're a greeter and you still have questions about some of the different sections on the intake and interview form, just ask the site coordinator or another volunteer. They can usually answer those questions for you very quickly. If they can't answer it to your satisfaction, Carl Lewis is always available as well, so feel free to contact him also. Let them know if the tax return does not fall into scope and why, and really that's to ensure that we're completing these tax returns accurately. We don't want to do anything that's out of scope because we want to make sure that we're doing the information that we've been trained on. And so if you explain to them that you'd hate to make a mistake because you didn't know how to do something, a lot of the time they're understanding. So it may not be convenient for them, but 211 does a really good job at coordinating this so that it isn't a big issue at the tax sites, but they can only work with the information they're given. So if the taxpayer hasn't indicated an income source to 211 and the appointment is made, then sometimes it takes getting to the tax site for them to understand that we actually cannot prepare their tax return, that we're not able to do that. So just keep that in mind. Like I said, the communication piece is the biggest part of all of this. So prepare the tax return, and it's okay to ask for help if you're a tax preparer, but do know how to utilize your resource information. It's fine to utilize your resource information or another volunteer, especially even if the taxpayer is there. So do know that, and if you can see that somebody has a form that you're not sure about while they're filling out the intake and interview form, ask another tax preparer or the site coordinator before you get started on the return. That'll help make it so that you know and understand what's going on with the client's circumstances. Just in the off chance that we can't prepare the return, we want to make sure that the client isn't spending too much time at the tax site getting ready for their appointment if we're not able to serve them. So to minimize some of these reject errors, that's why a lot of these items are in place. We're basically working the best we can with the information that we have to minimize any sort of errors. So make sure that you understand these before you get started on the tax return. And again, I can't say it enough, but just making sure you have that identification and the Social Security card or ITIN card. So we can utilize an ITIN card if somebody has an ITIN card instead of a Social Security card. We do not see this very often at our tax sites, but it has happened, so just be aware of that. We absolutely have to make sure that this process is in place, and that's again just to make sure that there is not any issues with identity theft. So make sure that as you're going through the intake and interview form after the client fills it out, that you're going through, make sure you're pointing to things. It's not good to say, so I see you've been a victim of identity theft, and yell that across the room. It's a little bit easier if you kind of point to the question and you say, so you've had some issues with identity theft, and say that to them, obviously in a way that they can hear, because sometimes people come in with hearing disabilities, but there's also times where you just want to make sure that your voice is a little bit lower to maintain that confidentiality. The section that people mess up in the most is it's part 2 on the intake and interview form, but it can really be identified as kind of the dependent information. So it's very easy to make a mistake when identifying somebody's filing status. So just make sure that the information in this area is filled out completely and accurately. Point to things again in case somebody had missed filling it out. Make sure that they missed filling it out and that they just didn't for whatever reason. We're not trying to go through and get too nosy, but we want to make sure we're providing the best service, and sometimes that just means asking some personal questions. Typically, the taxpayers don't have any issues with this. They really have a pretty good understanding and are not too concerned. So this intake and interview form is also really helpful because it shows what sort of certification level you need based on the income source. You'll see listed on here, it identifies the different income sources, and then it just has the, in that column, it has a B, an A, or an M, and that basically stands for basic, advanced, and military. And that way you can look at the intake and interview form, and if you have only certified to basic, which we do not encourage, but if you have only certified to basic and you see somebody has checked off one of the boxes that coordinate with the number with the A, B, or C, if it's something that's out of your scope, then you shouldn't be working on that tax return. So again, you can clarify some information a little bit, but you'll want to make sure to not do anything on the tax return if it falls under an A and you're only certified to a B. So there's also a section on this intake and interview form that asks about a client's healthcare coverage. I do encourage you as a taxpayer or as a tax preparer or greeter to go through this information with the client just to be sure that they filled it out correctly. And it may be easier just depending on what you find at the tax sites and what works for you individually. But I found that it's easier if I just fill this out for the client and I go through and ask them about their information and make sure that we're on the same page. And I do this kind of to save time and to explain some information about the Affordable Care Act as well as health insurance. So we have a whole little module training on the Affordable Care Act, so I don't want to jump into too much of that information here and now, but do know that there is a section that helps you kind of coordinate all of that and organize it. So don't worry about that too much. It's usually pretty easy dealing with the insurance information on these tax returns. So just a few key points again as you're getting ready to do your intake and interview training and get started on working with people and understanding people's circumstances and what you need to know to do their taxes. Make sure you're utilizing your due diligence. So if there's something on the form that looks a little bit funky to you that they filled out on the intake and interview form, just ask them. And I do preface it, especially if it seems like a somewhat personal question. I do ask and let them know that I'm not trying to be nosy, I'm not judging them, but I do need this information to make sure that their taxes are done appropriately. So make sure you're getting details on any information if somebody has lived in the home not all year, if they're not a traditional dependent. They can be claimed for all of that, but just confirm that the taxpayer wants to claim them, and then make sure that they can claim them by going through some of the rules that we'll go through in our upcoming presentations about dependency. If you're not certain about something, always make sure to ask your site coordinator or another volunteer. There's also the program manager, so Carl Lewis is always available as well. So make sure you're utilizing those resources as well as your book material, your publication 4012. Clients appreciate a thorough tax preparer, so don't be concerned if you have to ask a question or if you have to ask for clarification from the taxpayer themselves. So they're not going to be too annoyed of that typically. Just make sure that you're utilizing those skill sets that you develop. So in using your due diligence, just make sure that you're speaking clearly and loudly. Some of our taxpayers, like I indicated, are hard of hearing, so make sure that they understand everything that you're preparing. Reassure the taxpayer that you understand their circumstance, that you're hearing them and asking them effective questions. It may just be confirming, or it may be to probe some sort of information that you need to fill out a tax return. So when asking, for example, about any dependent care costs. So make sure you're asking the client if they had to pay out of pocket for any daycare and all of those different requirements of each of the different tax credits. Again, assuring that you're doing this for accuracy and that their tax return is done appropriately. So that quality review checklist, this is just a list of everything that's on there. So we'll run through these things just very, very briefly. But you'll want to make sure that you substantiate that identification. I think we've been over that quite a bit and enough. Make sure that you are certified to do the return. So before you get started on it, make sure that you're certified to work on it. Make sure that all the boxes on the intake and interview form have been marked off, either yes or no. If there is an unsure column, make sure you go through that and that all those questions are answered for your taxpayer. Make sure that the Social Security names, the names match their Social Security cards, as well as what's on the return, what's been printed on all their tax forms. All of those things need to match up. If there's any issues, let your site coordinator know. Make sure that the filing status of the client has been verified correctly and that the exemptions are properly in place and that all income is accounted for. Double check the intake and interview form for any sort of adjustments that the client might be eligible for, as well as that they're receiving any sort of tax credits that they're eligible for as well. Review the return one time with accuracy as the taxpayer or as the tax preparer. Just make sure you go through the quality review checklist once before you give it and hand it over to the to either the site coordinator or another volunteer to go through and do your quality review. Some of the things that review your tax return with the taxpayer after it's been quality reviewed. Make sure that they understand a lot of the things that you're talking about, that the numbers match up on either the direct deposit information or where it's being mailed to. You'll want to make sure that all those numbers are in place, as well as making sure that all of the tax information at the bottom of the tax return is correct and has been printed on the tax return, because that's what gets electronically filed over to the IRS. So some of the things I do want to talk about, so I did just touch on that we e-file everything. That's basically the quickest way for the IRS to receive any sort of information. So we e-file all of our tax returns unless the client specifically indicates that they do not want their tax return e-filed. If they do not have to. We always print out a copy for the taxpayer, but we can also print them out another copy to make sure that they have everything they need to mail it in. And there are some circumstances where somebody has to paper file. So do make sure you don't just glance over that, but ask the client, ensure that they want to e-file, make sure that they sign the e-file forms. Some of the common rejections that we get for e-filing, so these are the common mistakes that are made on the tax return, and a lot of them we don't have any control over. But if there is some sort of a rejection, we have to contact the client and get it corrected, which is a big pain to both the client as well as us, the site coordinators at your tax site. So if you're a volunteer and you've done somebody's somebody's tax return, there's a way to leave notes on the tax return. So double check when you come in the next time if you see that one of your returns has been rejected. A lot of the time the site coordinator has already contacted the client. But if you don't see a note on there that the client has been contacted, I would just bring it up to your site coordinator and confirm to see if you need to contact the client or what the circumstance might be. Some of the common reasons why returns are rejected are that there's a dependent that's being claimed on two different tax returns. So again, that kind of goes back as to why we spend so much time confirming people's identity. If somebody doesn't have a dependent social security card, that may be because it just may be a mistake. They can't locate it. They're not sure where it is. But it can sometimes also be a pretty good telltale sign that this person is actually not entitled to claim the child themselves. So sometimes it happens between parents, sometimes it's just a totally fraudulent situation. At any rate, if a dependent is being claimed on a tax return that they shouldn't be, it's a big pain for our taxpayers to deal with. We do have information on what they need to do, which we provide to them, but it really slows down the filing of their tax return, whereas a lot of people are coming in are already depending on that money being available. So make sure that the client understands that as you're going through some of the dependent information, why you're so diligent about it, and it's so that the return doesn't get rejected. A lot of the time, social security numbers don't match what the name indicates on the social security card. So there may be a person that comes in, they may have gone by John their whole life, and that's what they indicate on their intake and interview form. But if Jonathan is what's on the social security card and you submit John through the e-file, that return will get rejected. So even if somebody uses a nickname, make sure when you're filing the tax return that whatever's on the social security card or social security documentation forms, make sure that that's what's being filed for the taxpayer. The EIN on the W-2 being incorrect is sometimes a reason why there may be an e-file rejection. So that EIN, that's basically stands for the employer identification number. So sometimes on a W-2 somebody receives, they have a business that went out of they worked for a company that went out of business, or there may be a lot of different reasons why. But at any rate, the IRS does not have the identification number on file, and that can be a reason for somebody having their return rejected. And that's the case, the client just needs to contact the employer and try to get that figured out. If they can't find that out through the employer, then sometimes they have to work with the IRS on what can be done with that. Another reason why we've seen a lot of tax returns rejected, and this happened last year more than ever, is that the tax return itself is missing an identity theft PIN, and that's sometimes called a PIN. At any rate, if somebody's had some issues with identity theft, the IRS typically creates what's called this IP PIN for them. It's identity theft PIN numbers that the IRS sends. I believe they're 6 to 7 digits, and the IRS will send the client a letter, and in the letter the PIN will be available. It'll tell the client what the PIN is. If somebody's had any issues in the past, then they typically need to file this for several years following the issue with identity theft, and it's just to confirm that their taxes are actually being filed by them. So it's a good thing, although it does create some hardship. So sometimes it's hard for the client if they don't keep good track of their paperwork. If they've thrown out the IP PIN, it can sometimes be a pain to get it reset or get it just get a new one. So make sure that the client understands that if there is an identity theft PIN, that we do need it. And if they have one and they haven't brought it to the tax site, then we should be encouraging the client to reschedule so that we can do their taxes when it's complete. If the taxpayer is someone else's dependent, that's another reason why we get a lot of returns rejected, is they're actually being claimed on somebody else's return. A lot of the time this is happening when somebody is having their taxes done when they're away at school, or if they are in school, their clients or their parents are claiming them, but they can still file their tax return, but they have to tell the tax preparer that they're being claimed on another return. If that's the case, then it can be changed on the tax return itself. It can be identified that the tax filer is on another return. And it's a pretty easy fix, but we just have to know that information. And again, that goes back to the whole interview method and why it's so important for us to ask clients questions. So congratulations, you made it through the first section. So we've done the introduction video, and now this is section 1. I know it's a lot of information. Definitely make sure that you go through the 2 different trainings, the standards of conduct training and exam, and then do the training for the intake and interview. It's some really good information. I just summarized all the very, very important points that you see a lot at our VITA Services for West Michigan sites, but there's some other really crucial information in there. So as you go through, make sure you're going through these modules. Start to get familiar with the software itself as well. So there's some training information and examples of how and what the software looks like and how to do the tax returns in it. So make sure that you start looking through that information as well. Again, if you have any questions, make sure to contact Carl Lewis. His information is on our website for the VITA westmichigan.org. So it's www.VITA-westmichigan.org. And Carl Lewis can go ahead and answer your questions as well too. But thank you so much for watching, and please stay tuned for our next module.